Raymond Falcone had killed men for less than a broken promise. Yet on this golden afternoon his hands were trembling around a bouquet of white roses. 41 of them, one for every week he'd known Sloane Whitlock, and tucked against the thorns, a velvet box holding a 5-carat diamond that had taken 3 jewelers and 1 very nervous courier to assemble. The most feared Mafia boss in Providence, the man whose name made dock workers lower their eyes and rival families lock their doors, had canceled a meeting worth millions to do the one thing he'd sworn he'd never do again: trust a woman enough to marry her. At 37, Ray had built an empire out of fear and silence, ruling the harbor with an iron fist and a single unbreakable rule: you don't raise a hand against the weak, the way his father once had against the men who couldn't fight back. He'd buried that softness so deep he'd nearly forgotten it existed. But Sloane, with her polished elegance and her old money name, was supposed to be the answer, the clean face that'd wash his dynasty respectable, the partner who'd finally make the cold mansion feel like something other than a fortress. Everything was perfect. The light was perfect. The silence was perfect. And then he heard the screaming. Ray's blood ran cold, because that voice didn't belong to the graceful woman he was about to propose to. He moved around the side of the house, past the rose beds, and what he saw rooted him to the stone path. There, in the afternoon sun, stood Sloane in her flawless white blazer, and she was hurling fistfuls of dirt and fertilizer at a young woman kneeling helplessly on the ground. Cora Lennox, the gardener, 27 years old, arms thrown up over her face, didn't fight back, didn't even cry out. She only knelt there and absorbed it, the way someone learns to when the world has spent years teaching them they're worth nothing. Trash, Sloane spat, her voice dripping with a cruelty Ray had never once heard from her. People like you were born on your knees. The bouquet slipped from Ray's fingers and hit the grass with a soft, final thud. Sloane spun around, and for one fractured second, the most powerful man in the city watched something flicker across his fiancée's perfect face. Not shame, but the cold panic of a woman who'd been caught. Then, just as fast, the mask snapped back into place, sweet and smooth and rehearsed. "Ray, you're home early, my love." But Ray wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the woman on the ground, at the dirt on her cheeks, the quiet dignity in her lowered eyes, the way she whispered that it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, because she was too afraid of losing the job that was keeping her family alive. And in that moment, the man who trusted no one felt something crack open in a chest he'd believed was solid stone. Because he suddenly understood, he didn't know who the woman he was about to marry really was, and he understood even less how a single kneeling stranger was about to unravel everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and his own frozen heart. If this story already has you hooked, do me a favor and hit that like button right now. It truly helps more than you know. Share it with someone who believes people deserve to be treated with dignity, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's get back to that garden, where a fallen bouquet was about to change 2 lives forever. Cora remained kneeling on the ground, her head bowed low, and when Ray didn't walk away at once, she stammered again in a broken voice that it was only a misunderstanding, that she had done wrong, that she was sorry, the apologies spilling out in a frantic rush, as though, if she spoke quickly enough, the anger of the 2 powerful people standing around her would dissolve, and she would still have a job tomorrow morning. Her dirt-stained hands clenched together before her chest, and the way she lowered herself, the way she took the blame for something that wasn't her fault, made something inside Ray's chest go rigid. He didn't say a word to her. He didn't trust his voice to remain calm if he opened his mouth at that moment. He only looked at her for one more breath, long enough to carve into his memory the image of a person who had endured so much, who had become so used to being trampled that she had begun to believe she deserved it. Then he turned away, leaving the bouquet of white roses lying face down on the grass, and the red velvet box tipped on its side beside it, the 5-carat diamond reflecting the afternoon sunlight with empty meaning, and walked toward the house. Sloane called after him, her voice already turning completely tender, asking where he was going, saying she would come inside right away, but Ray didn't look back. Every step he took along the stone path was an effort not to turn the shock inside his chest into something worse. In all his 18 years in power, Ray Falcone had done things that made people lose sleep. He had signed sentences that were never written down on paper. He had looked straight into the eyes of traitors without blinking. But there was one line he had never crossed, not once, and never allowed anyone under his command to cross either, and that was never to strike at the weak, at those who had no way to fight back. because he had once seen with his own eyes what that looked like, and it had nailed itself into him when he was 19 years old. His father, the man who had taught him every rule of the underworld, had been the kind of man who used his fists on people who couldn't hit back, and Ray still remembered what it felt like to stand in a dark corner and watch his father do it. He remembered swearing to himself that he would never become that version of a man, that if he had to be ruthless, he would be ruthless only with equals, with those who chose to step into this game and understood its price. And yet the woman to whom he had just been ready to offer his entire future, the woman he had chosen to cleanse the Falcone name and turn it into something respectable, had just stood there and crushed another human being, simply because she could, simply because no one stopped her. Ray pushed open the heavy door of the house and stepped into the cool darkness of the main hall, and almost at once Desmond was there, the butler who had served this family since Ray's father was still alive, a 50-year-old man with silver hair and eyes that never missed anything. Desmond began to speak, intending to say something about dinner, but he stopped mid-sentence when he saw Ray's face, and in that instant, the old butler knew something was wrong, because he had seen Ray come home after blood-soaked nights with a calmer expression than this. He asked softly whether he could help with anything, his gaze flicking briefly toward the door behind Ray, as though trying to read what had happened in the garden, but Ray only shook his head and said in a hoarse voice that he wanted to be alone. Desmond nodded and stepped back, but his eyes lingered on Ray's figure for one more second, a quiet concern Ray knew too well not to recognize, and then he withdrew without a sound. Ray walked down the long hallway to the study, closed the door behind him, and only then did he realize he was still holding the ring box, or rather that he had picked it up at some point without knowing it. His fingers clenched so tightly around the red velvet that they had gone white. He set it on the oak desktop, the diamond flashing beneath the yellow light, the promise of a future that 1 hour ago he had still believed was right. Then he pushed it away, sliding it across the desk until it stopped near the edge, unsteady on the rim, and he sat down in the leather chair, braced his elbows on his knees, laced his hands together over his mouth, and let the silence of the room close in around him, while the question he didn't want to face kept echoing without end: who the woman out there truly was, and how he could have been so blind for the past 41 weeks. About 40 minutes later, there came a soft knock at the door, the exact kind of knock Sloane always used, 3 light and hesitant taps, and when Ray didn't answer, the door still slowly opened. She had changed out of the dirt-stained white blazer and into a soft cream silk dress, her blonde hair swept neatly into a bun that revealed her slender neck, her face washed clean and touched with a delicate layer of makeup, so subtle that she looked as though she had just been crying, and Ray realized at once that even that fragile look had been calculated, though 1 hour earlier he never would have noticed it. She stepped inside quietly, closed the door behind her, and stood there for a while as though she didn't dare come any closer, her bright eyes looking at him with wounded hurt. Then she said softly that she knew what he had seen was terrible, that she didn't expect him to understand right away, but she begged him to give her a chance to explain. Ray said nothing. He only leaned back in his chair and looked at her, and his silence seemed to push her even deeper into the role she knew so well, because she began telling him in a trembling voice that she had endured that gardener girl for many months now, that Cora was clumsy and careless, that she had ruined countless things, and that this afternoon she had cut down the entire bed of roses that Sloane's own mother had planted before she passed away, the rose bushes that were the last keepsake she still had of her mother, and when she saw them destroyed, she couldn't hold herself back. She had lost control for just 1 minute, 1 weak minute she would regret for the rest of her life. Her tears fell at precisely the right moment, rolling down her cheeks in flawless lines, and she stepped closer, knelt beside his chair, and took his hand in both of hers, her hands warm and soft, the complete opposite of the calloused, dirt-covered hands Ray had just seen in the garden. And she looked up at him and said she wasn't the person he had just witnessed, that he had known her for so many weeks, that 1 moment of losing control couldn't define who she was. Every word was placed exactly where it needed to be. Every pause was measured, and Ray sat there listening to the woman he had intended to marry, only a few hours earlier, perform her pain so smoothly that he couldn't help wondering how many times she had played such a part in front of him without him ever knowing. He thought about the rose bed she claimed had belonged to her mother, and a cold corner of his mind, the corner that had kept him alive for 18 years, quietly noted that he had never once heard her mention those rose bushes during all the time they had known each other, that he had never seen her set foot in that garden even just to admire it, and that the only person he had ever seen carefully tending every rose branch there, was the girl still out there, kneeling and enduring the blame. But he didn't say any of that. He had learned long ago that when you doubted someone, the sharpest weapon wasn't confrontation, but silence, letting the other person believe they had won and continue revealing more. So he slowly drew his hand out of hers, not roughly, and said in a low, calm voice that he understood, that everyone had moments of weakness, and that she should go rest, because today had been a long day for both of them. Sloane's face briefly loosened with relief, a relief she quickly hid behind gratitude. She squeezed his shoulder gently, whispered that she thanked him for understanding, then rose, dried the corners of her eyes with her fingertips, and walked toward the door with the gait of someone who had just escaped something. But just before she touched the doorknob, Ray spoke, his voice so light it sounded almost casual, asking what the Gardner girl's name was, and Sloane froze for half a second, a silence so brief that no one would have noticed unless they were paying attention, before she answered that she didn't really remember. Something like Cora, then gave a soft laugh and said he didn't need to trouble himself with such small matters. She walked out, closing the door behind her, and Ray remained still in the leather chair, staring at the closed door, his mind marking one thing clearly, that the woman who had just left had lived under this roof for months with that girl, and hadn't even bothered to remember her name, while the girl in the garden remembered the name of every rosebush she cared for, and the seed of suspicion planted in him that afternoon began to take root in silence, deeper than he had expected. In the days that followed, Ray did something he had never imagined he would do under his own roof. He watched, quietly and patiently, in the same way he had always studied an opponent, before deciding whether that man deserved his trust, except this time the subject was the woman he had planned to marry. He began coming home at unusual hours, lingering in rooms he normally didn't visit, and he realized that Sloane was two entirely different people depending on whether she knew he was watching. One morning, standing hidden behind the frame of the study door, he heard her voice carrying from the dining room, sharp and full of contempt, scolding Desmond for setting the wrong tableware for lunch, calling the butler who had served this family for more than 30 years an old, senile fool. And what chilled Ray wasn't the words themselves, but the casualness of her tone, as if humiliating another human being were something she naturally had the right to do. Desmond only bowed his head and answered, "Yes, miss," then quietly corrected it. And when he turned away, Ray caught the old butler's eyes, a tired endurance he had carried for far too long. And Ray wondered how many times things like this had happened right under his nose without him ever knowing. Blinded by the smiles she saved only for him, that afternoon, he saw her again in the hallway, where a young maid had accidentally dropped a towel, and Sloane didn't shout. She simply stopped and looked at the girl with a gaze that fell from above, a gaze that made it clear she considered the person standing before her worth less than the things inside the house. And the girl bent low, apologized in a panic, and hurried away like a small animal escaping from claws, while Sloane merely brushed off her hands and continued walking, her face instantly returning to its familiar elegance. But it was the contrast that haunted Ray, because during those same days, he saw an entirely different image at the far end of the garden. From the study window looking down, he saw Cora kneeling beside the ruined rose bed, not to endure punishment again, but to heal it, her hands gently gathering the soil back into place, pruning the broken branches, propping up the surviving stems with bamboo stakes she had carved herself, and she did all of it with a tenderness Ray had never seen anyone give to anything in this house. One morning, he went down to the garden earlier than usual and stopped behind a hedge when he heard her voice, so soft that at first he thought she was talking on the phone, but then he realized she was speaking to the rosebushes themselves, whispering to them that they were much stronger than they looked, that being broken didn't mean it was over, that as long as the roots still held to the earth, there was still a chance to bloom again. And Ray stood there motionless, because he knew very well she wasn't truly speaking to the plants. She was speaking to herself, telling herself something perhaps no one else had ever said to her. He watched her free a thorn caught in the sleeve of her faded shirt, watched her wipe her forehead with the back of her hand and leave a streak of dirt behind, then smile at a tiny rosebud just beginning to open on a branch she had thought was dead, a tired smile, but a real one, more real than all the perfect tears Sloane had shed in his study a few days earlier. Ray left the garden before she could realize he was there, and all that day, the two images kept overlapping in his mind. One woman with noble blood and a respected name, who treated people like garbage, and one girl with nothing in her hands, except calloused palms, who still cherished even broken branches as though they deserved to live. He hadn't allowed himself to conclude anything yet, because he understood that a careful man never judged based on only a few moments, and he reminded himself that appearances could deceive in both directions, that perhaps the girl was playing a role of her own in her own way. But the cold, suspicious corner of him, the corner that was rarely wrong, had begun leaning to one side, and Ray knew he wouldn't be at peace until he understood who the girl in the garden truly was. That uneasiness finally pushed Ray to do what he had always done with anyone who stepped into the orbit of his life. He had someone look into Cora Lennox, and within 2 days Toby placed a thin file on his desk. Thin, but enough to leave him sitting in silence for a very long time after he finished reading it. The girl was 27 years old, raised in an old working-class neighborhood north of Providence, and her mother had died right there on the delivery table while giving birth to her second child, a baby girl named Maisie, which meant that from the time Cora was 16, she had been both sister and almost mother to that tiny newborn. Explaining the age gap between the two sisters and the way she had carried everything on her shoulders since she was far too young. Her father, a man named Frank Lennox who had once worked at the harbor, had been left with half his body paralyzed after an accident many years earlier, and from then on, he could only sit in one place in his wheelchair, while the full burden of their family of 3 fell entirely on Cora. But what made Ray's chest tighten lay in the final pages, where the file stated that little Maisie, now 11 years old, had a congenital heart defect that was growing worse and needed an expensive surgery. Their family had no way to afford, and to pay for her sister's treatment, to pay for her father's medicine, to keep their small house from being seized for debt. Cora had been working 3 jobs at once, gardening by day for wealthy families like his, cleaning an office downtown in the evening, and standing behind the counter at a grocery store on weekends, with almost no day of rest at all. Ray set the file down and remembered one small detail he had once seen but hadn't understood. The time he had seen her quietly wrap up the lunch portion given to the workers and tuck it into her old cloth bag instead of eating it. And back then he had thought it wasn't worth noticing, but now he understood. She had been going hungry so she could bring that food home to her father and sister, and that late understanding made something ache inside the chest he had thought long since hardened. That afternoon, as if fate wanted him to witness it with his own eyes instead of merely reading it on paper, Ray passed the narrow path leading to the tool shed at the far end of the garden and stopped when he heard Cora's voice drifting out, trembling and tightly restrained. She had her phone pressed to her ear, her back turned to him, and he heard her tell someone on the other end that she was sorry, that she knew the surgery had already been scheduled, but she still hadn't gathered enough money, and she begged the hospital to give her just a little more time, to postpone it for only a few more weeks. She promised she would find a way, her voice breaking on the final word as she said she couldn't lose her only sister. She stood there in silence, listening to the other end of the line for a long while, her shoulders shaking. Then she softly said thank you, and hung up, and Ray watched her standing motionless among bags of soil and flower pots, both hands covering her face, and for the first time he saw her allow herself to cry, not in loud sobs, but with the quiet tears of someone used to suffering alone, her thin shoulders trembling for a few brief beats. But what shook Ray even more than those tears was what happened immediately afterward, because in less than a minute, she drew in a deep breath, wiped a hand across her face, erased every trace of weakness, then bent down, lifted a heavy bag of soil onto her shoulder, and returned to work as though nothing had happened, as though she didn't allow herself to collapse for even one more second, because if she fell apart, there would be no one left to stand up and care for the people she loved. Ray quietly stepped back, withdrawing into the shadow of the trees, and he stood there for a long time after she had disappeared from sight, his heart weighed down by a strange feeling he hadn't felt in many years. And for the first time in a long while, the man who had been so certain his heart had turned to stone realized it was still beating, and it was hurting. That night, Ray didn't sleep. He sat for a very long time in the dark study, the image of those thin shoulders trembling and then forcing themselves upright again, returning to his mind over and over. And near dawn, he did something he himself couldn't fully explain. He picked up the phone and called his most discreet financial attorney, the man who specialized in handling streams of money Ray didn't want anyone tracing, and gave him one brief instruction, that the entire cost of the heart surgery for a child patient named Maisie Lennox at the city's children's hospital had to be paid in full, immediately, through a charitable trust bearing no one's name, leaving no clue whatsoever that led back to him, or to the Falcone name. The attorney, long accustomed to never asking for reasons, only confirmed that it would be handled by morning. And when Ray put the phone down, he sat there wondering what he had just done and why, because in all his 18 years in power, he had never given anything away without calculating some return in exchange. Every dollar he spent was a cord of obligation, a debt he could collect later. That was how his world worked, and that was how he had survived. But this time, there was no cord at all. Cora would never know it was him, would never owe him, would never have to bow her head and thank him, and it was that very uselessness in terms of benefit that unsettled Ray most of all, because it meant he had done it for no reason except that he couldn't bear the thought of a child dying simply because her sister couldn't gather enough money, and that the girl would have to carry one more loss in a life already burdened with so much loss. He told himself this was only an exception, one weak moment he wouldn't repeat, that it changed nothing about who he was, and he tried to believe it. 2 days later, from the familiar window of his study, Ray saw the moment he had been waiting for without admitting to himself that he had been waiting. Cora was in the garden, the phone pressed to her ear, and he saw her whole body suddenly go rigid, the hand holding the pruning shears dropping loosely to her side, and then she sank down onto the grass as though her legs could no longer hold her. He couldn't hear a single word, but he didn't need to hear, because he could read everything in the shape of her body, in the way her trembling hand covered her mouth, in the way her shoulders this time didn't shake from restraint, but broke open into sobs, born from an entirely different feeling, the overwhelming relief of someone who had just had a burden lifted from her, a burden she had believed would crush her. She sat there among the rose bushes she had brought back to life, tipping her face toward the sky, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time they were the tears of someone who no longer had to hold herself together, and Ray stood behind the glass, silently witnessing the joy he had created but would never claim credit for, and he realized he didn't regret that at all. On the contrary, a strange warmth rose inside his chest, a feeling whose name he had forgotten long ago. The girl out there would tell her father and her sister about a nameless benefactor they would never know in this lifetime. Perhaps they would pray for that person. Perhaps they would be grateful to a faceless shadow. And Ray, the man whose name the entire city spoke with fear, would remain forever only that nameless shadow in their story. And strangely enough, he felt that it was enough. He turned away from the window, returned to the files and the calls from the underworld waiting for him, and put his familiar cold shell back on as though nothing had happened at all. But deep inside, something had shifted, quietly and irreversibly, like a seed just beginning to crack open beneath the dark soil. And Ray knew, though he didn't yet want to admit it, that he would never again be the man he had been. After that day, Ray began going down to the garden more often. At first, he told himself he was only taking walks to clear his head after tense meetings. But he knew very well that wasn't the real reason. And the first time he stopped to speak with Cora was on a late afternoon, when she was bending over the rose bed that had begun putting out green shoots again. He asked bluntly whether they would survive, and Cora looked up, briefly surprised to see the master of the house standing there. But what caught Ray's attention was that she didn't lower her eyes or shrink back the way Desmond did, the way the young maid did, the way almost everyone who had ever stood before him did. She simply looked at him directly, and answered that they would live, that plants were tougher than people thought, as long as they were given enough time and weren't abandoned. Something in that plain answer held Ray in place, and he found himself asking another question, then another, and little by little, those brief conversations beside the garden became a habit neither of them named. She didn't know who he was in the world beyond these walls, or if she had heard whispers. She didn't let them change the way she treated him, and that was exactly what drew Ray in with a force he couldn't understand. Because all his life he had known only two kinds of people, those who feared him and those who wanted to use him. No one had ever looked at him and simply seen a man. Cora spoke to him the way she would speak to anyone else. She argued when she disagreed. Once, she told him outright that he was watering the wrong way when he tried to help, then laughed when she saw the surprise on his face, saying that probably not many people dared tell him he was doing something wrong. And Ray, instead of being irritated, felt something at the corner of his mouth shift, a strange expression it took him a moment to recognize as the beginning of a smile. He was careful never to reveal that he knew about her father, about her sister, about all the burdens she carried. He kept those things as his own secret, and instead he let her tell him only what she wanted to tell, and she said very little about herself. Mostly, she spoke of plants, of how a seed needed darkness before it needed light, of how the poorest soil could sometimes nourish the strongest things, and Ray slowly realized that whenever she spoke about gardening, she was speaking about something much larger than that. One afternoon, she asked him, in that curious voice without the slightest fear, why a man like him, living in a house this large and this cold, he would trouble himself to come out into the garden and stand around talking to the gardener about rose bushes. And the question made Ray pause, because he had no answer he was willing to say aloud. So he only replied that perhaps it was because this was the only place in the house where no one was pretending anything. And Cora looked at him for a long while after that, with a gaze that made it seem as though she had glimpsed some real piece of him beneath his hard shell. Then she nodded softly, and said she understood that feeling, that sometimes plants were more honest with you than people. They stood there in silence for a while, amid the smell of damp earth and newly opened roses. And Ray was sharply aware of the distance between them, aware that he shouldn't be here, that the woman he had promised to marry was still inside the house behind him, that everything about this situation was wrong and dangerous, but he didn't walk away. He told himself this was only curiosity, that he was merely trying to understand a person he found hard to read. But even as he told himself that, he knew he was lying to himself, because in the world of calculation and betrayal where he lived, where every smile hid a knife, this girl's simple honesty appeared like a kind of light he had never expected to crave so deeply. And the closer he stood to it, the more he realized he didn't want to leave, even as every instinct for survival inside him was ringing a warning bell that this was the beginning of something he would not be able to control. That fragile light had not had time to warm Ray for long before the familiar darkness of his world came closing in. On an evening when Toby knocked on the study door, wearing an expression Ray had learned to read over many years, the expression of a man bringing bad news. Toby was his right hand, the 34-year-old man Ray trusted more than anyone else left in the organization, and when he placed a thin folder on the desk and said there was something wrong in the flow of money, Ray knew at once this wasn't a small matter. Over the past several weeks, funds that should have moved through Falcone's discreet channels had begun shifting off course. Numbers weren't matching, transactions were being seen by someone before they could be completed, and more dangerous than anything, several of his underground partners had received anonymous warnings about deals that should have been known only to a very small number of people inside the organization. Toby lowered his voice and said he had quietly followed a few leads, and all of them pointed to one name, or more precisely, one alias, because no one knew this person's real face. People called him the broker, a ghost in the underworld who specialized in buying and selling information and acting as the middleman for takeovers, a man who belonged to no family but could bring an entire empire down from the inside if he got hold of the things he needed. Ray sat still and listened, his face showing no emotion at all, but inside his head every gear was turning at dizzying speed, because for internal information to leak to this extent, the person helping the broker couldn't be an outsider. It had to be someone close enough to hear things that were never spoken aloud, close enough to touch documents that never left this house. But what sent a chill down his spine was the final detail. Toby hesitated before reporting that during one trace, his men had seen a familiar car parked in an empty lot outside the city, a place where it had no reason to appear, and that car belonged to Sloane. Toby spoke very carefully. He didn't dare claim anything for certain, only said that perhaps it was a coincidence. Perhaps she had gone there for some completely harmless reason, but Ray had known Toby long enough to understand that this man never brought a detail to his desk if it was truly harmless. A coldness spread through Ray's chest. Not the coldness of surprise, but of confirmation, as though the final piece had just locked into a picture he had dimly sensed for a long time but hadn't wanted to face. And this time it wasn't about a gardener girl having soil thrown at her. This time it was about lives, and about the entire empire he had bled to keep. He didn't tell Toby what was spinning through his mind. He only nodded slowly, and ordered him to continue watching, as discreetly as possible, recording every meeting, every call, every unusual flow of money, but absolutely not to act, not to let anyone, including anyone inside the house, know that they had begun to suspect, because Ray understood one thing that 18 years in the dark had taught him, that when an opponent believed they held the upper hand and that their prey was still blind, that was when they became careless, and carelessness was the sharpest weapon he could turn back against them. So he decided he would continue playing the role of the blind future husband. He would still smile at Sloane across the dinner table, still let her believe she had soothed away what happened in the garden and that he suspected nothing, while quietly weaving each strand of the net around her, patiently waiting until she stepped into it herself. That night, after Toby had gone, Ray stood for a very long time beside the window, looking down at the dark garden, where the rose bushes slept quietly in the shadows, and he realized that the calculating world he had thought he had left behind during those peaceful afternoons with Cora had never truly released him. It was still there, cold and hungry, and now it was baring its teeth from the very place he had least expected, from the woman wearing the ring he had almost given away. In the days that followed, one question alone ate away at Ray's mind, not what Sloane was doing, but how she could possibly be doing it, because he sat down and went back through every piece of information that had leaked, and the more he traced it, the more he recognized a truth that chilled him, that the things being smuggled out were not things Sloane could have known on her own. She was never allowed into the organization's closed meetings, had no access to the safe where the real ledgers were kept, was never present when he and Toby discussed the most sensitive deals, and yet information from those very places was flowing out, which could only have one explanation: that there was a third person, someone living right inside this house, someone close enough to hear things that were never spoken aloud, and trusted enough that no one bothered to guard against them, acting as her eyes and ears. That thought turned every meal, every hallway, every familiar face in the house into a question mark, and Ray began quietly sifting through each person one by one, not through interrogations, but by silent observation, with the instinct of a predator who understood prey far too well. He noticed who was present when a document was brought out, who passed through the hallway at hours when they had no duties there, who had expenses that didn't match their wages, and every name that rose in his mind brought its own separate pain, because these were not strangers. These were people who had lived under this roof for years, people he had thought he understood down to the bone. There was the cook who had fed his family for a decade. There was the driver who had taken him through the most dangerous streets without betraying him once. And there was Desmond, the old butler who had been beside him since his father was still alive, the man who had taught him to tie his first tie and had stood silently beside him on the night he buried his father, and forcing himself to place even Desmond on the list of suspects, made something inside Ray twist, a betrayal in reverse that he himself was inflicting upon his own trust. But he didn't allow emotion to cloud reason, because he had paid for that once before, and the price had been his father's life. Every night when he closed his eyes, he saw himself at 19 years old, saw the man who had once been his father's most trusted right hand, the man his father had trusted enough to place his life in his hands, the man who had sat at the same dinner table with their family, had put an arm around Ray's shoulders and called him nephew, and it was that very man who had sold his father to their enemies and sent him to his death in a dark alley. The lesson carved into Ray's blood from that night was that no one, no matter how close, no matter how long they had been loyal, could ever be placed beyond suspicion, because the knife that cuts deepest always comes from the hand we guard against the least. It was that bloody lesson that had shaped Ray into the suspicious man he was now, and now it rose again, cold and ruthless, forcing him to look at every familiar face through a new lens filled with doubt, and the air inside the house, already cold, grew even more suffocating. Every ordinary greeting now carried an invisible weight. Every averted glance could be a sign of guilt, or simply fear before an increasingly unpredictable master. Ray kept all those suspicions locked inside himself, sharing them with no one, not even Toby, because now even saying them aloud could be a risk, and he understood that this hunt had to unfold in absolute silence, step by step, until the traitor exposed themselves. But amid all the suffocation and suspicion tightening around the house, one strange thought slipped into Ray's mind and refused to leave, that the only person on the grounds he didn't want to put on the list of suspects, the only person his eyes sought as a place of rest in the middle of the storm of doubt, was the girl in the garden. And he didn't know whether that was because his instincts trusted her, or because he had begun to fear what he might see if he turned that suspicious gaze toward her. It was the very thought of wanting to protect Cora from every suspicion that pushed Ray to do something that seemed harmless. He wanted to understand her more fully, wanted to know what accident had forced her father into a wheelchair and begun the chain of misfortunes that had swallowed the entire family. So he asked Toby to dig deeper into Frank Lennox's past, this time not about Cora, but about the day that man's life had been broken in two. A few days later, Toby returned, but this time he didn't place the file on the desk right away. He stood there in silence for a moment, and that hesitation alone made Ray look up, because Toby had never hesitated before anything. When he finally spoke, Each word fell into the room like a cold stone, saying that the accident that had left Frank Lennox half paralyzed 8 years earlier at the port had not been an accident, that according to the old records he had managed to trace. Frank had been a worker who witnessed something he shouldn't have seen and refused to stay silent, a stubborn laborer who had dared to come forward as a witness about an illegal shipment at the dock, and to punish him as well as warn the others. Someone had staged a falling cargo incident that looked like an occupational accident, a heavy steel beam released at the wrong moment, crushing his spine and turning a strong, healthy man into a cripple in a single instant. And the port where it happened, the shipment Frank had intended to expose, the order to make an example of him that had been given in the dark, all of it carried one name and one name only: the Falcone organization. Ray sat frozen, the blood in his body seeming to turn to ice, because 8 years ago he had been only 29 years old, only 10 years into inheriting his father's place, and still struggling to seize real control from the older men in the organization, men who believed they had the right to act in the Falcone name without asking his permission. And that cruel order, he was almost certain, had been given by that old guard, by the traitor and his accomplices who had manipulated the organization during those early chaotic years, when Ray had been too young to hold every thread in his hands. But that reasoning brought him no comfort at all. It couldn't erase the naked truth that even if he hadn't given the order directly, even if he hadn't even known about it, the name he carried, the empire he had inherited and later strengthened with blood, was the very thing that had stolen Frank Lennox's legs, had driven an honest family into ruin, had forced a 16-year-old girl to carry the whole world on her shoulders, and now that girl had become the woman he sought out every afternoon, like the last remaining light in his life. Ray rose and walked to the window, both hands gripping the sill, looking down at the garden where Cora was bending among the rose bushes she had brought back to life. And for the first time in many years, he felt an emotion his power and money had never had to face. Guilt. A guilt so deep and silent it made him feel as though he couldn't breathe. She didn't know. She was standing there, tending the garden of the very enemy who had destroyed her family, without having any idea. Every smile she had given him, every honest story she had told him, all of it had been offered to a man who carried the name that had nailed her father to a wheelchair, and that truth rose between them like a wall only he could see, invisible but heavier than anything. He understood that he had to tell her, that she had the right to know. But he also understood that the moment he spoke that truth aloud would be the same moment he lost her forever, that the fearless, straightforward gaze she always turned on him would be replaced by a hatred he couldn't bear, and that deeply human cowardice tightened around his throat. Ray stood there for a long time in that silent struggle, with conscience demanding truth on one side and the fear of losing the only precious thing he had found by accident on the other. And he realized that power could subdue an entire city but was utterly helpless before the harshest court of all, the one holding trial inside his own chest, and that no matter what he chose, he had already owed that girl a debt he might never be able to repay in this lifetime. The struggle inside Ray had not yet had time to settle when a heavy rainstorm came crashing down one night, and with it, another storm erupted right in the main hall of the house, where Ray heard Sloane's shrill voice rising above even the rain lashing against the glass doors. He stepped out and saw a scene that had become all too familiar. Cora standing there soaked through after running in from the garden, her hair plastered to her pale face, while Sloane stood blocking her path, holding a silver bracelet high in one hand, loudly accusing the gardener girl of sneaking into her room and stealing the piece of jewelry, her voice full of false outrage as she declared that people like Cora couldn't be trusted, that she had endured enough, and that this time the girl had to be thrown out that very night, with no wages, no letter of reference, so she would learn the price of daring to touch what belonged to her. Cora shook her head, her voice trembling from the cold and from the injustice of it, saying she had never set foot in that room, that she would never take anything that wasn't hers. But how thin and hopeless her words sounded before the power of the woman standing above her. And Ray saw in her eyes not the hope of being cleared, but the resignation of someone who already knew her voice carried no weight in this house. But this time Ray didn't stand still in the shadows and watch as he had before. He walked straight into the middle of the hall, and his presence alone made the entire room fall silent. He looked at the bracelet in Sloane's hand and asked in a voice so low and cold it sent a shiver through the room where she had found it. And when Sloane stammered that she had found it in the gardener girl's coat pocket, Ray turned and called for Desmond, ordering the butler to summon the chambermaid who cleaned Sloane's rooms to come up and verify it. In that instant, He caught exactly what he needed. A flicker of panic crossing Sloane's face. The same flicker of panic he had seen in the garden on that fateful afternoon. The chambermaid was brought up, trembling as she stated that she herself had seen the lady of the house place the bracelet into Cora's coat pocket that afternoon. And as the truth was laid bare in the middle of the hall, the air grew thick and heavy. Sloane immediately changed her tone, letting out a strained laugh as she said it was only a misunderstanding, that perhaps she had been mistaken. But Ray cut her off with a single sentence, firm and allowing no argument, saying that Cora wasn't going anywhere, that from now on, no one in this house was permitted to lay a hand on her, and that if anything like tonight ever happened again, the person leaving this place would not be the gardener girl. The entire main hall went dead still, because this was the first time Ray had openly chosen to stand with the lowest servant in the house against his own fiancée. And Sloane stood there, her face white, her eyes flashing with something between shock and caution, because she was intelligent enough to understand that the man who had just snapped at her was no longer the blind man she had believed she held in her hands. And a new suspicion began to stir inside her, that something had changed, that he was looking at that other girl with eyes that should have belonged only to her. Sloane turned on her heel and went upstairs without another word, leaving Ray and Cora standing in the hall with the low murmur of rain all around them. And only then did Ray turn to look at her, seeing that she was still trembling, wet hair dripping onto her shoulders. Her eyes lifted to him with a storm of emotions she couldn't name, gratitude, confusion, and fear before a protection she didn't understand why she deserved to receive. Ray took off his own coat and draped it over her shaking shoulders. A simple gesture, yet it made them both go still, because in the moment his hand touched her shoulder, an invisible current passed between them, close enough that Ray could hear the soft rhythm of her breathing, close enough that he had to summon every ounce of willpower not to pull her nearer. Cora whispered her thanks, her voice breaking, then asked him why he was doing this for her. And Ray looked deep into her eyes for a long moment, knowing that the true answer would drag with it a truth he still didn't dare speak, so he only answered softly that it was because it was right, and because too many people in her life had treated her as though she was worth nothing, and it was time someone showed her the opposite. Then he stepped back, forcing himself to turn away before the restraint inside him collapsed, leaving her standing there in the hall, clutching the coat that still held his warmth, and both of them knew, though neither said it aloud, that some boundary had been silently crossed on that rainy night. That rainy night didn't only change something between Ray and Cora, it also lit the fuse of something far more dangerous inside Sloane, because as she stood at the top of the staircase looking down at the sight of her man draping his coat over the shoulders of a gardener girl, she understood a truth she couldn't accept, that she was losing Ray, and worse than that he might have begun to suspect her. As a practiced manipulator, Sloane knew that the best defense was always to strike first, and instead of trying to win Ray's affection back with tears as she always had, she decided to make a preemptive move meant to destroy the greatest threat to her, the very girl who had caused his stone heart to crack. For several days, she prepared in silence, and then one evening she came to Ray's study wearing not the face of a jealous wife, but of someone who had just painfully discovered something terrible. She placed a strange phone and several sheets of paper on his desk, and in a trembling voice, she said she had found these things hidden in the tool shed out in the garden, the place where the gardener girl came and went every day. Ray looked down at the evidence laid out before him, including messages exchanged with an unnamed number about his travel schedule, about the meetings he attended, even secretly taken photographs of documents inside this very study, and most frightening of all, a hastily written note mentioning the name, the broker, along with a promised sum of money, everything arranged to point straight toward one conclusion, that Cora was not the innocent gardener girl he had believed her to be, but a spy planted by the broker deep inside the mansion, to act as his eyes and ears, that her honest tenderness was only a clever disguise, that she had used Ray's trust to pull out the very information now causing his empire to crack. Sloane played the role of the shattered wife perfectly, saying through tears that she didn't want to believe this any more than anyone else, that she knew he had feelings for the girl, and that was exactly why it hurt her even more to expose her, that she was only doing this because she couldn't stand by and watch the man she loved be deceived by a traitor right under his own roof. Ray sat for a long time without saying anything, his face hard as stone, but inside him was a violent storm, because this evidence struck directly at his deepest wound and his greatest fear, the obsession with betrayal from those closest to him, the ghost that had killed his father and turned him into a man who trusted no one. And one part of him, the suspicious part that had kept him alive for 18 years, immediately screamed that this was exactly what he had always expected, that he had been a fool to let a beautiful face and a few stories about plants make him lower his defenses, that no honesty was ever truly real, not then, not now, not ever. That suspicion was so poisonous and so powerful that for one moment it almost drowned everything else, almost erased the afternoons in the garden, the conversations without fear, the image of those thin shoulders forcing themselves upright after breaking down in tears, and Ray felt the ground beneath him tilt, no longer knowing what was real and what was false. But right in the middle of that whirlpool of doubt, something held him back. One small detail his cold mind couldn't ignore, that the evidence was too perfect, too complete, presented too conveniently and too easily, as though someone wanted him to find it. And he remembered the flicker of panic on Sloane's face on the rainy night before, remembered that she was the one he had just caught, staging a false accusation, and now she was also the one bringing him another accusation. Ray revealed no sign of wavering. He only nodded slowly and told Sloane that he would look into it, that she had done the right thing by telling him, and that praise made a flash of triumph light her eyes before she hurried to hide it. But after she had left the room, Ray remained alone among the pile of evidence, torn between the fear of betrayal that had been carved deep into his blood and a fragile but stubborn faith in the girl out in the garden. And he understood that this was the true test, that someone was playing a very skillful game, and that if he chose the wrong trust this time, he would lose not only his empire, but perhaps the last human part still left inside him. Ray hadn't yet had time to decide what he'd do with that pile of false evidence when the crisis struck faster than he'd expected, because Sloane and the person pulling the strings behind her understood that planting suspicion alone wasn't enough. They needed to push the entire game toward its final move before Ray could see through everything. And they chose Cora's most fatal weakness as the place to strike. The next afternoon, Cora received a call from an unknown number. And only a few seconds after she answered, her whole world collapsed, because on the other end of the line was a man's cold voice telling her that Maisie was in their hands, that the little girl had been picked up from home on her way back from school by someone pretending to be an acquaintance, and that if Cora wanted her sister to stay alive, she had to do exactly what they said. Their demand was cruel and clear. She had to disappear from the Falcone mansion at once without a word of goodbye, had to leave behind the impression that she'd run because she'd been exposed, and most importantly, she had to send Ray a pre-written distress message meant to lure him into handing over control of the organization's secret trust fund as the condition for Maisie's safety, turning her into a puppet in a scheme she didn't understand at all. The desperate mother inside Cora wanted to obey immediately, wanted to rush out and save her sister at any cost. But even in the middle of her panic, she was still clear-headed enough to realize one thing, that whoever was behind this knew far too much about Ray's trust fund, knew far too much about Maisie's schedule, knew far too much about every corner of this house, and those things could only have come from someone very close. In that most desperate moment, instead of quietly running away as they'd ordered, Cora did the bravest and most reckless thing of her life. She ran straight to Ray's study, pounded on the door in the middle of the night, and when he opened it, she collapsed in front of him, tears streaming down her face, telling him through broken sobs that her sister had been kidnapped, that they were forcing her to hurt him in exchange for her sister's life, that she didn't know whom to trust or where to run, so she'd run to him, the only person in this world she believed had enough power to save her sister. Ray stood frozen, staring at the girl kneeling at his feet, and inside his mind, two truths collided violently, because only the night before, Sloane had placed evidence on his desk accusing this girl of being a spy, and now that very girl was kneeling before him, confessing that someone was using her to hurt him, and the cold, suspicious mind inside him immediately screamed that this could be another performance, a more elaborate trap, that every tear could be false, that perhaps she was playing exactly the role the mastermind had written for her in order to finish deceiving him into handing over his power. But when Ray looked down at her face, he saw something that 18 years of reading people told him couldn't possibly be faked. The raw terror of someone about to lose the most precious person in her life, a naked pain with no calculation in it, and he remembered the image of her wrapping up her food to bring home to her sister. Remembered her sobs of relief when the hospital bill was paid. Remembered the way she'd once whispered that she couldn't lose her only sister. And none of those things could have been acting. Cora took his hand, her calloused fingers trembling as they clutched him tightly, and begged him to save Maisie, saying she didn't care what happened to her, that he could think of her as anything he wanted, could punish her afterward if he wished. But the little girl was completely innocent, and only 11 years old. She didn't deserve to pay the price for an adult war she knew nothing about. Ray looked at her for a long time, the whole room seeming to hold its breath, and he understood that this moment was the turning point around which the rest of his life would turn, that he had to choose. Either to trust the cold evidence and the instinct of suspicion that had seeped into his flesh and blood, or to trust what his heart had quietly known for a long time, and for the first time in his life, the man who had always chosen the safety of doubt found himself facing a choice where every calculation became meaningless before the pleading eyes of the girl to whom he had somehow come to owe a debt he couldn't name. In that moment, suspended between doubt and faith, Ray looked down at the calloused hand gripping his, then looked into the red-rimmed eyes lifted toward him in pleading, and something inside him, something that had been frozen for 18 years since the night he buried his father, finally began to thaw. He thought about his whole life, a life built on the foundation of one iron belief, that every human being would betray you if the price were high enough, that trust was a luxury meant only for fools and dead men, and he realized that this cold philosophy, though it had kept him alive, had also turned his life into an empty fortress with not a single true soul inside it. He knelt down to Cora's level, a gesture the most powerful man in the city had never made before anyone, and he took both her hands in his, saying in a low, solid voice that he believed her, that she didn't need to beg anymore, that he would bring Maisie home safely even if he had to burn this entire city to the ground. Cora snapped her head up and stared at him, unable to believe what she'd heard, because she had prepared herself for suspicion, for questioning, for being treated like a traitor. And yet this man had chosen to believe her at the very moment when every piece of evidence had turned against her, and that choice made her break into tears again, but this time because of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the feeling that someone was willing to stand on her side. Ray understood that this decision went against every instinct for survival he had, that if he was wrong, the price could be everything. But for the first time he accepted a wager based not on calculation but on faith, and in that very moment of choosing to trust another human being, he felt as though he had found a piece of his humanity he'd thought had died long ago. He rose, immediately called Toby in, and the vulnerable man who had just knelt beside Cora disappeared, giving way to the cold, sharp crime boss the whole city feared, except this time that strength was being placed in service of a purpose he had never had before. When Toby arrived, Ray laid out before him the entire picture he could now see clearly, that Maisie's kidnapping, the false evidence planted to frame Cora, and the financial leaks leading to the broker were all links in the same conspiracy, all of it arranged to remove Cora while forcing him to hand over control of the trust fund with his own hands, and the person standing at the center of that web was none other than the woman wearing the ring he had almost given away. They sat down and mapped out every step. Ray ordered Toby to quietly mobilize the most loyal men, trace the number that had called Cora to find where Maisie was being held, and at the same time he decided he would play the exact role the enemy had written for him. He would pretend to take the bait, pretend he believed Cora was the spy, and that he was preparing to yield in order to save his marriage, because only when the enemy believed the trap had sprung exactly as intended would they reveal a weakness and bring him closer to the hostage. Ray told Cora she had to fully play the part of someone panicked and desperate if the kidnappers contacted her again, had to stall for time, had to seem obedient and willing to follow their orders, while he and Toby quietly tightened the circle from behind. And even though every passing second was torture for her as she thought of her sister frightened somewhere unknown, Cora still nodded, placing all her trust in the man who had just chosen to trust her. Before they moved into action, Ray looked at her one last time and said softly that she should listen carefully, that no matter what happened, he promised he would bring her sister back. And in his eyes at that moment there was no longer any of the ice of the Falcone boss, only the resolve of a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. Not for power or survival, but for a human being. And that was the moment Ray Falcone truly changed forever. As Toby traced the number that had called Cora and began undoing each link in the chain, one question still haunted Ray: how Sloane could have known every detail about the secret trust fund, about Maisie's schedule, about every corner of the mansion, because she couldn't have gotten those things on her own. There had to be a hand inside helping her. And when Toby finally placed the results of days of silent surveillance on Ray's desk, the truth that emerged left even Ray, a man who had thought himself hardened against every betrayal, stunned into silence. The secret calls, The times a car had left the mansion late at night to meet one of the broker's people, the small streams of money being transferred into a hidden account, all of it led back to one person, and that person was Desmond, the old butler who had served the Falcone family for more than 30 years, the man who had taught Ray how to tie his first tie, who had stood quietly beside him on the night he buried his father, the man Ray had loved and respected like a second father. Ray summoned Desmond to the study in the middle of the night, and when the old man stepped inside, one look at Ray's face and the documents laid out on the desk was enough for him to understand that everything was over. He didn't deny it. He didn't fall to his knees and beg. He only stood there, his shoulders, once always so straight, now sagging beneath an invisible weight, and his eyes filled with tears as he admitted everything. But what hurt Ray most wasn't the betrayal. It was the reason behind it, because Desmond said through choking grief that many months earlier, the broker had come to him, not with money, but with a threat. He knew where Desmond's only granddaughter lived, the child who was all that remained of the daughter Desmond had lost, and he gave him a choice. Either Desmond became his eyes and ears inside the mansion, or the little girl would vanish from his life forever. Desmond said he had been torn apart every night, that every piece of information he passed along felt like a knife he was driving into himself, that he knew he was betraying the man he regarded as his own son, but standing between loyalty and the life of his own flesh and blood, he had chosen his blood, and he wasn't asking for forgiveness. He only bowed his head and said he deserved to die, and that he was ready to accept whatever Ray intended to do to him. The whole room sank into a heavy silence, and Ray stood there with rage boiling inside him, demanding the kind of punishment written into the brutal laws of his world, because in that world, betrayal had only one price, and everyone knew what that price was. His hand clenched into a fist, and for one brief instant, the ghost of the cold Falcone boss rose inside him, demanding blood. But then he looked into the tear-soaked face of the old man who had spent his life serving Ray's family, a man who hadn't betrayed him out of greed or ambition, but because he had been backed into a corner by love for an innocent child. And Ray thought of himself, thought of how only a few hours earlier he had been ready to burn the whole city down to save the sister of the woman he loved, and he realized that if he had been in Desmond's place, he might have done the same. The man whose name the whole city spoke in fear, the man who had never allowed any betrayal to survive, did something even he hadn't expected. He lowered his fist, and in a hoarse voice, he told Desmond that he wouldn't kill him, that too much blood had already been spilled in this family because of knives driven into backs, and that he refused to become the kind of man who would kill a father, simply because that father had tried to save his child. Instead, Ray set one condition, that Desmond had to repay what he had done by becoming Ray's own piece on the board, had to continue pretending to be loyal to the broker and Sloane, had to feed them the false information Ray would arrange, turning the inside man who had nearly destroyed him into the key that would help him overturn the entire game. And Desmond, tears rolling down his wrinkled face, nodded with choking gratitude before a mercy he had never dared dream of, swearing that he would use the rest of his life to repay the trust he had lost. While Ray and Toby tightened the circle and turned Desmond into their hidden piece on the board, Cora refused to sit still and wait to be rescued like someone helpless, because through all those sleepless nights of fear for Maisie, her mind kept feeling its way through every memory of her time working in the mansion, trying to find anything that might help. And then one morning, while she was standing silently beside the familiar rosebed, a fragment of memory suddenly lit up inside her mind. She remembered an afternoon many weeks earlier, when she'd been bent over pulling weeds in a hidden corner of the garden behind the hedge, and Sloane had walked out to that area without knowing anyone was nearby, speaking on the phone in the cold, sharp voice she only used when Ray wasn't around, and when she ended the call, in a fit of irritation, she had torn a sheet of paper into several pieces and thrown them down into the bushes along the path before turning and walking back into the house. At the time, Cora hadn't paid the slightest attention. She had only thought it was the lady's trash, and meant to clean it up later. But because she was busy, those scraps of paper had accidentally been swept together with the layer of dead leaves and soil around the base of the rosebush, lying there silently until now. Cora's heart began pounding when she realized those pieces of paper might still be exactly where she had brushed them aside, and if they contained anything connected to the people holding her sister, they might be the weapon she was desperately searching for. She went to Ray at once and told him about the memory, and though they both knew that if she wandered alone in that corner of the garden now, Sloane or her people might become suspicious, Cora still insisted on going out herself to retrieve them, because she was the only one who remembered the exact spot, and because she couldn't bear the feeling of standing outside the fight while her sister's life hung by a thread. Ray understood the determination in her eyes, understood that trying to stop her now would be useless, so he only told her to be extremely careful, to pretend she was doing her ordinary work, and he placed Toby's men at a discreet distance to watch over her so she wouldn't be in danger. That afternoon, beneath the pale sunlight, Cora returned to the familiar corner of the garden with a small trowel and a pair of gardening gloves, looking on the outside no different from a gardener cleaning up a flower bed. But her heart was pounding wildly in her chest as she knelt beside the rosebush where memory had led her, quietly digging through the soil and dead leaves little by little, her hands trembling slightly from tension more than from the cold. And then she touched them, the scraps of paper, yellowed and damp from being buried under the earth over time, but still intact. She picked them up one by one, quickly hiding them inside her glove and coat pocket, trying to keep her face calm, though inside she was breaking open with relief. Then she stood, lifted the trowel onto her shoulder, and walked slowly back into the house as though she'd merely finished an ordinary afternoon of work, never once looking back. Once she was somewhere safe, she and Ray spread the scraps across the tabletop and patiently pieced them together like a puzzle. And when the final piece fit into place, they both held their breath, because there before their eyes were lines Sloane had hastily written down during an exchange, directly mentioning the name, the broker, an enormous sum of money, and an agreement whose meaning couldn't be understood any other way, that Sloane would help him seize the Falcone empire from the inside in exchange for her share. A piece of the truth in her own handwriting, living evidence that no denial could erase. Ray looked at the scraps of paper, then at the girl standing before him, the girl who hadn't folded her arms and waited for him to act, but had stepped into danger herself to help save her sister and save him as well. And in the eyes he turned on her then, there was something far beyond admiration, because he understood that what bound them now was no longer a matter of the strong protecting the weak, but of two people standing side by side in the same fight, and it was her quiet courage that had placed in his hands the final piece he needed to bring the entire conspiracy crashing down. With the final piece in hand, Ray laid out his forces for one move that would end everything, and he chose to make that move at the regular meeting of the Council of Families, where the heads of the underground powers in the region gathered inside the grand hall of an old mansion, because he understood that to bring Sloane down in a way that couldn't be reversed, he had to expose her before the very people whose honor and recognition were the only things that could decide a person's fate in this world. Before stepping inside, Ray had sent Toby to lead a team of his finest men, following the trail from the phone and the false information Desmond had fed back to the broker, to raid an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts where Maisie was being held. And just as Ray stepped into the center of the council, the phone in his pocket vibrated with a brief message from Toby, saying the girl was safe, unharmed, and being brought back to her sister. And only after reading those words did Ray truly allow himself to loosen enough to begin his attack. Sloane was there beside him, still triumphant in the belief that her trap was about to close, that Ray was about to surrender control of the fund, and she had no idea that she was sitting in the very middle of the trial that would finish her. Ray rose in the center of the grand hall, his voice low and resonant, drawing the attention of everyone present, and he began his presentation, not with emotional accusations, but with cold evidence stacked one piece upon another. He produced the money streams that had been siphoned away, the leaked transactions, the proof of an inside hand that had sold out the organization to a faceless man known as the broker, and when the tension in the grand hall rose to its highest point, he delivered the decisive blow. The reassembled scraps of paper Cora had risked herself to find, a document carrying Sloane's own handwriting, clearly recording the agreement to seize the Falcone Empire and the sum of money she would receive. The entire council was shaken. Every eye turned toward Sloane, and the elegant mask she'd worn so perfectly for so many years began to crack in front of them all. She sprang to her feet and denied everything, loudly accusing Ray of inventing it, calling it all a fabrication. But her voice had lost its usual sweet composure, twisted now by panic and fury. Ray calmly brought out the final witness. He gave a signal, and Desmond stepped in. The old butler stood before the council and recounted the full truth. How Sloane herself had joined hands with the broker, how she had staged the false evidence to frame an innocent person, and how she had ordered the kidnapping of an 11-year-old child to force Ray's hand. And every word he spoke was another nail driven deeper into Sloane's fate. Cornered, With no way left to retreat, the last layer of nobility vanished completely, and Sloane's true self was exposed before the most powerful people in the region. She no longer wept or played the victim, but screamed in a fit of rage, admitting everything through the very madness of her denial, hissing that Ray didn't deserve this empire, that she deserved far more than the role of a decorative wife, that she was exhausted from having to smile beside a man she despised, and each venomous word that poured out of her revealed in full the cruelty and ambition she had hidden for so long behind that perfect face. The whole council fell silent, watching the woman tear apart her own image with her own hands, and in the eyes of people who worshipped only power and loyalty, Sloane Whitlock had sentenced herself. She was no longer a noble lady worthy of respect, but only a traitor stripped bare. Ray stood at the center of it all, calm and cold, looking at the woman to whom he had once almost given his future, now collapsing in the wreckage she'd created herself. And he felt no pleasure, no triumph, only a cool stillness, because justice had been carried out not with blood, but with truth, and more important than anything else. Somewhere beyond that grand hall, an 11-year-old girl was being brought back into the safe arms of the sister who had never given up on her. After the night Sloane tore apart her own image before the council with her own hands, the wheels of underground justice began to crush each person involved in the conspiracy quietly and without mercy. The broker, the faceless man who had believed himself safe behind layer after layer of intermediaries, was finally traced through the very information Desmond managed to extract, and in the underworld, where there were no courts except its own laws, he vanished from every board of power. The name that had once made the families cautious was erased completely, as though it had never existed, an ending Ray didn't need to explain in detail to anyone, but the true hand pulling the strings behind Sloane turned out not to be only her own ambition, because when Ray followed the flow of money all the way to its source, he discovered that Veronica, Sloane's mother, the elegant woman still respected by high society, was the real mind behind the entire takeover plan, the one who had raised her daughter into a weapon and pushed her into marriage with Ray like a pawn in her own game. Ray dragged that truth into the light, and the financial empire of the Whitlock family, built on a spotless reputation and upper-class connections, collapsed within only a few weeks, as business partners turned away one by one, and filthy secrets were dug up from the dark. The Whitlock name, once a symbol of nobility, became something no one dared to stand beside. Sloane lost everything, not her life, but every single thing she had ever used to define herself. Reputation, status, wealth, and future. She was cast out of the world she had longed to rule, left to live the rest of her life like a shunned shadow, carrying the stain of a traitor no family wanted to touch. And for someone like her, that fall was more brutal than death itself. As for Desmond, Ray kept his word. He didn't punish the old butler by the blood laws of the underworld. He had Desmond's granddaughter taken to a safe place beyond the reach of any threat, then allowed Desmond to withdraw and live his final years in peace. A mercy they both understood was a gift greater than anything else, and the old man left with silent gratitude and a vow to carry that forgiveness with him for the rest of his life. When every danger had been cleared away, and Maisie had been safely reunited with her sister, that should have been the moment Ray could enjoy the peace he had fought to win, but he knew there was still one final truth he owed Cora, a truth heavier than every conspiracy that had just passed, and though every cell in him wanted to bury it in order to keep her, he understood that holding her beside him with a lie would make him no different from the people he had just destroyed. So he went to her, and with all the courage he had left, he told her the truth about the day her father's life was broken at the harbor, that it hadn't been an accident, that the Falcone name he carried, the empire he had inherited, was the very thing that had stolen Frank's legs and driven her whole family into years of suffering. He looked straight into her eyes as he spoke, not looking away, not excusing himself by saying he had been young then and hadn't given the order. He only placed the naked truth before her and gave her full right to judge him, and he watched her face go pale, watched each word cut into a wound she had thought had scarred over, watched the eyes that had once looked at him with such honesty fill with pain and confusion. Cora stepped back, shaking her head, tears falling silently, and she said through choking grief that she needed time, that she couldn't stand there right now, that she didn't know how to place the man who had saved her sister and the man who carried the name that had destroyed her father inside the same person. Then she turned away, walked out of the room, and left the mansion. And Ray, the man who could bring down an entire empire with a single nod, the man who had more than enough power to keep her there through force, money, or even the debt of gratitude he had given her family, did none of those things. He only stood in silence and watched her leave, letting her be free to choose, because he had learned from her the deepest lesson of his life, that loving someone doesn't mean possessing them, but respecting their right to walk away, even when it crushes your heart. Spring came late that year, but gently, and with it came the good things Cora had once never dared to dream of, because Maisie's heart surgery had succeeded beyond all expectation. The little girl's cheeks had color again now. She ran and laughed and played like any other child, her small heart, once so fragile, now beating with the strong rhythms of a future opening wide before her. Her father, Frank, also began the best rehabilitation program money could provide, and this time it was no longer help from a hidden benefactor, but part of what Ray had openly chosen to do, because after everything that had happened, the man who had once ruled the harbor through fear chose a different road. He quietly withdrew from the underworld, transferred and dissolved the blood-stained businesses his father had left behind, and used his vast fortune to establish a compensation fund for every family the Falcone organization had harmed over the years, with the Lennox family as the first name on that list. He didn't do it to win Cora back. He didn't attach any condition or expectation to it. He did it because he understood that there are debts no apology can ever repay, debts that can only be answered by changing oneself from the roots up. And for the first time in Ray's life, he lived through nights no longer haunted by the shadows of the past. As for Cora, after weeks of pain and inner struggle, she gradually came to understand that the man who had been brave enough to tell her the truth, even knowing it might cost him her forever, wasn't the name that had destroyed her family, but the man who had chosen to break away from that very name. And she used the compensation money to begin again in her own way. She opened a small flower shop on a quiet corner street and named it Thornless, meaning no thorns anymore, like a message that she had passed through the years of being torn by sharp edges, and had finally found a gentle piece of sky for herself. On a beautiful sunny morning, while Cora was arranging flower pots outside the shop, a familiar figure appeared, and it was Ray, but not the powerful boss in an expensive suit. He was simply a man holding a bouquet of white roses, the same kind of flowers from that fateful afternoon long ago, except this time there was no showy diamond, no flawless arrangement, only him standing there with all his plain and honest sincerity. He told her he hadn't come to buy back the past or demand anything from her. He had only come to ask whether she would give him a chance to begin again from the very beginning, not as a benefactor and someone indebted to him, not as master and gardener, but as two equal people trying to grow something new together. Cora looked at him for a long time, looked at the white roses in his hands, and remembered everything they had survived together. Then she smiled, a relieved and genuine smile, like the first rosebud opening on a branch she had once thought was dead, and she nodded yes, not because of gratitude or debt, but because she had seen true change in him, and because her heart, after so much hurt, still had enough courage left to believe one more time. They didn't hold a grand engagement. Instead, that very afternoon, the two of them went out to the small patch of earth behind the flower shop and planted a new white rosebush together, 4 hands gathering the soil around its roots. And in that simple moment, there were more promises than any diamond ring could ever hold, because they understood that love was like a garden. It needed time, it needed patience, it needed tending every day, and most of all, it could only bloom when it was grown in the soil of respect. Ray and Cora's story closed where it had begun, beside a white rosebush, but this time not in screams and fear, but in the warm sunlight of a new beginning. And it leaves us with a simple yet profound lesson that a person's dignity doesn't lie in the status or wealth they possess, but in the way they are treated and the way they treat others. That true power isn't the ability to make others afraid, but the courage to become kind, and that no one, no matter how poor or lowly, should ever have to kneel in order to receive the basic respect owed to a human life. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share this video to help us spread meaningful stories and hear more compelling stories every day. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story, whether you have ever witnessed or experienced moments when human dignity was overlooked in the very life around you. Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep inside your heart, because every story you tell can also become a source of inspiration and healing for someone else. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last second. May all of you watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling each day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next stories.